Welcome to Unholy Histories, the Humanist Heritage podcast brought to you by Humanist UK. I'm Andrew Copson, Chief Executive of Humanist UK.
And I'm Madeline Goodall, Head of the Humanist Heritage Project.
We're the hosts of this new podcast series where we will be speaking with experts about Britain's humanist history,
uncovering the people, events and ideas that have shaped both humanist thought and our national life. While humanism is rooted in the reality of the here and now, it has often found significant expression in the what-ifs of worlds imagined or yet to be. The Oxford Dictionary of Science Fiction defines the genre as one where the setting differs from our own, whether through new technology, alien contact, or an alternate history, but where that difference is based on rational extrapolation. Crucially, these shifts are explained in scientific or logical terms, rather than the supernatural. It is, in many ways, the ultimate humanist sandbox, a place where we can explore the consequences of our ideas without looking to the heavens for answers. From the scientific romances of H.G. Wells and the feminist utopias of Florence Dixie, to the radical social visions of Naomi Mitchison and the logic-driven ethics of Isaac Asimov, speculative fiction has allowed us to test drive our values. So today we ask, how does imagining the impossible help us to build a better reality? And why has the speculative fiction genre always been such fertile ground for humanist thought? In this episode of Unholy Histories, we explore the intersections of humanism and speculative fiction, and what these strange new worlds reveal about our very human values. And to unpack these ideas, we're joined by S.I. Martin, British historian, author and educator specialising in Black British history and literature. He's published both fiction and non-fiction, and is a patron of Humanist UK. And Katie McGregor-Stone, a literary critic and researcher of science fiction and utopian literature, who's currently writing a book about Frankenstein. Welcome, both of you. So we normally start by asking our guests to introduce themselves, I suppose, and how they came to, in this case, I guess, be interested in what we're talking about. So science fiction and the kind of work you do. So perhaps, should we start with you, Katie? How did you come to be interested in this area?
Yeah, so I studied literature, and then I was kind of increasingly drawn to science fiction as a branch of literature where I think the politics are often on the surface in a really explicit way. There are very prominent science fiction writers who I think would be the marginal weirdos of more mainstream literature, but become kind of shaping voices in the genre, because it is one where you are forced to kind of confront how we are collectively making the world there and imagining a new world. You sort of see that the world as it is contingent, is open to change and can be transformed. And so I think that's a radical proposition that's at the core of the genre. So I did my master's and PhD was about science fiction and utopian literature and how they help us to reimagine the world.
So inspiring opening to things there. And what about you, Steve? How did you come to be interested in, I guess, fiction as a whole?
How can I say? Well, yeah, I suppose a one-word answer, it is escapism. Total escapism. I was that child, that one of two black children in the village who'd be waiting keenly for the arrival of the book bus, the mobile library. And I'd just dive into, that row of spines of yellow and purple Victor Gallant's classic science fiction imprints, because it just took me away from reality. It took me away from the world, and it engaged a lot of my interests, to do with human potential, to do with the extraordinary, with interrogating the nature of reality, etc. It's always been my first love, but I'm obviously took a step away from that into looking at history, which particularly Black histories, which contained all of the elements of my fascination, like abduction, whose reality is it, alien worlds, it's all of this fantasy stuff made flesh. That's basically my road into it.
I think there's lots of humanists actually for whom science fiction or speculative fiction or alternative histories have really been a genre that's attractive. And I think that is for all the reasons that are said. But I do also like the idea that it's a realm where we can test our ideas. And I also think that in the absence of, like you said in your introduction, Mandy, in the absence of supernatural, it is a place where you can dream and imagine. And, that is, even humanists have even written some pretty good ghost stories, of course. But I mean, we're not talking about that now. We're talking about the proper science fiction and speculative fiction. When I was growing up, mine was Star Trek, of course. It wasn't until I was older that I realized it was literally written by humanists, and the stars were mostly humanists, and the script editors were humanists. So it was so colored by that view. So I'm not anything as lofty as discussing utopianism in the works of H.G. Wells or Olaf Stapledon, although probably we'll get into that. I'm much more sort of like, isn't the world of Jean-Luc Picard amazing? And wouldn't the world be wonderful if it was like that? And maybe one day it will be like that. And I think, I still think at the back of my head that I live my life on the assumption that one day it will be like that, in spite of the evidence of the world in the last 20 years. And so I think it is a sort of escapism as well. I agree with everything that's been said so far about the value of this, the meaning of this type of fiction for humanists. But I suppose the bit that we haven't mentioned yet, apart from in your introduction, Maddie, and I know that you've looked at this, Maddie, is the way in which the people who were writing some, at least, future-looking or futurist fiction in the early 20th century were also at the same time trying to campaign to bring that future about. I mean, that's true of things like feminist writers.
Yeah, that's really interesting thought, actually. Yeah, and I guess I'm really drawn to what Katie said at the beginning as well about these kind of marginal weirdos, which is a kind of fun way of saying what we often say about the kind of early campaigners for lots of the kind of causes that they were campaigning for, whether that was secular education or whether it was reproductive rights or, whatever it was, that they were often outsiders, pushing back against things.
I think we officially say eccentric radicals, Katie, rather than marginal weirdo. We happen to be recording this on the 130th anniversary of Humanist UK. And I think in our History of Humanist UK post recently, we said the eccentric radicals of the Victorian period. But maybe on our 140th, Maddie, we should say the marginal weirdo.
We'll credit you, don't worry. So I suppose to come back then to the concept of science fiction or speculative fiction, and I think that idea that, yes, on the one hand, they were often imagining worlds, imagining possible different realities or whatever it was, but, very rooted in the real world as they were seeing it and perhaps issues that they wanted to address. So how did science fiction as a genre really emerge? How did it get started? Shall I come to you, Katie, for this?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think there are so many kind of ways to tell the story because it just depends, like, what strand of science fiction that you're interested in. Like, I think it started being called science fiction in the kind of 20s magazines, but lots of people talk about H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and the scientific romance, which we've mentioned. I think that one area of it that I'm interested in terms of the history is the utopian history of science fiction. So the idea that one way of kind of tracing back the history of the genre is looking to writers who wouldn't have described themselves as science fiction writers, like that didn't exist as a thing yet. But what they were interested in doing was imagining a place which doesn't exist, but that is specifically designed to be a desirable place, a place that you want to get to. And in that way, I think that sort of, for you were talking about kind of political campaigners, and I think for anyone who's interested in trying to change the world, there has to be that idea of, well, what do you want the world to be like when you get there? Have to have a politics that's not just reactive against the things that you don't want, but that is a kind of positive vision of this is where we're going. So I sort of see that history that, there are kind of big utopians. Utopia gets its name from Thomas More's text, which is written in the 16th century, this imaginary island, which he wrote as a critique of English society of his day. He's saying the two books of Utopia, one of them is like, look at yourselves, this is rubbish. And the other one is, and I know that because I've been somewhere better and this is how they do it in Utopia. And there are lots of people who basically riff on that same theme and write in a similar way. But I think that the people that I'm most interested in, I guess, are people who are already coming at that from a kind of critical perspective, are criticizing the utopian tradition from within, and are saying part of Thomas More's vision is an imperialist vision of King Utopus being a conqueror. There are slaves in utopia. This is a society which in itself needs to again be radically reimagined. So the idea that the reimagination is never done, and that these kind of imperialist roots of the genre need to be excavated and reimagined. So writers like Begum Ruqayya Sakhat Hussain, who wrote Sultana's Dream in the very early 20th century, but that's just about the idea of, again, using these familiar tropes of imagine you fall asleep and you wake up and the world is better. It's a different world. And so she imagines a world run by women, a kind of feminist, matriarchal utopia. Pauline Hopkinson is someone I'm also really interested in. She wrote a book called Of One Blood, again at the turn of the century, which is a big utopian time, which is a kind of alternate history, but it's imagining a world where there's an Ethiopian kingdom, which is really futuristic, has hid itself from the world, and the protagonist kind of finds their way, who is African American, finds their way to it through kind of following this as ancestral lineage. Again, offering a different history as well as a different potential future, another way of thinking about how things could be better, could have been better, could still be better. So yeah, I mean, there are loads of texts. I won't just go through them all. But those are some of the things I'm interested in that become science fiction later, I think.
Were they often reacting to, very definitely to kind of specific issues as they saw them in the world? So obviously you mentioned somebody like Thomas More, but I think in your notes of this episode, you mentioned like W.E.B. Du Bois and writers like that. Were there specific social issues that they were poking at when they were writing these things? Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Pauline Hopkinson knew Du Bois and was very much part of the kind of Reconstruction era battle against the very recent legacy of slavery in the US. Du Bois wrote a science fiction story. It's collected in Dark Matter, which is a great collection of Black science fiction, but it's called The Comet. And it imagines a world where the population of Manhattan is wiped out apart from two people, one of whom's a Black man, one of whom's a white woman. And they sort of find each other wandering around in New York. And they think they're the last people on Earth. And it's this possibility of maybe Earth will begin again without the kind of weight of racism, basically, is what Du Bois is positing. And then the helicopters come in or the planes come in, and it's like, no, it was only Manhattan. Absolutely not. It's incredibly undercut at the end. It's a great story. But yeah, that's one way of saying, you take this kind of, you use science fiction or utopianism to cut into contemporary social issues of racism, of feminism, of all manner of oppression. And, in Du Bois' case, is literally blow it up and see what you can make out of the rubble, I think is one way that people approach it anyway.
Until they meet the father and it all comes to a nice, tidy end. The young woman's father survived.
Steve, you know about that story too.
Yes, it's a great piece of the potential power of science fiction, but also its limitations. These works have to be published, they have to be disseminated, and 1920 is when he was presenting this, and inevitably there has to be a nice, tidy resolution for the period. So, but yeah, it's fascinating. But my own engagement with it goes back a century beforehand to 1818. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I think all others, they stood on her shoulders, the world that she created, the set of anxieties, that converging set of anxieties around industrialization, the shocks of scientific discovery and imperialism. They were all the foundation of what came before. She was literally putting the science into fiction in a popular way for the first time, to my knowledge. Yeah, that's where it came from. And again, looking at subjects like say, empire in fiction, you just see all of these colonialist themes being repeated and reproduced, in the works of, say, Verne and Wells. There's often an idea of going to a lost world, going into under the sea or in space, but there's always that element of dominion and of control, of imperialism in a sort of on almost a galactic way. There's no end to it. And, obviously finding or coming across these other peoples, if people they truly be, who are living underwater or on some plateau in the lost world or hobbling around in the moon, who need to have some sort of order in their lives or some sort of controlling element. So yes, it's a contested field, I see, as a very, very contested field until maybe in the 1960s.
Yeah, thinking about, again, how that kind of comes into humanism, the links between humanism and imagination and kind of testing out those ideas. As you say, there's the kind of idea of control, who has it, and it being human beings or, rather than, or wresting control from somebody else. But then there's also all of the kind of foibles and the follies of human beings that often come out in these things. And also things, investigating stuff like the potentials, the possibilities of science itself and discovery, but also the dangers of that. And I suppose that it certainly comes through in, something like Frankenstein or lots of these things, doesn't it? But that immediately makes me think as well of kind of later campaigners like Bertrand Russell or H.G. Wells against, things like nuclear power, for example, or, those kind of things which had a real world threat to them. And then the efforts that they took in real life, like H.G. Wells with the, Declaration of Human Rights and things, to take the world in a direction that they wanted it to go, but often having tested ideas out or explored them in fiction before. So yeah, thinking about that, I guess. And Frankenstein maybe is a good place to return to, given that Katie,
That's a good way to get back into it, maybe with Katie, the whole Frankenstein question.
I think that it is really centrally concerned with this idea of what happens when you don't accept that the way that things are is just divinely ordained, is just the way it will always be, and instead start really looking at humans as agents and kind of shapers of history. So I guess my view of Frankenstein is that I think people sometimes read it as just a cautionary tale, as just like, isn't it bad to try and do science, do too much science and experiment and change the world? And obviously Frankenstein's experiments go horribly wrong in a way. It's not what he intended to happen. The results are terrible in his life. He makes the creature and the creature ends up killing everyone in his family. But I think that Shelley is really drawn to the idea of, the full title is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, and Prometheus obviously being the titan who steals fire from the gods, and
a very much of symbol of humanists in the 18th and 19th century, really. The number of humanist pamphlets that have Prometheus handing the fire to humanity or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that idea of she's not just saying don't be Prometheus, like it's not an anti-Promethean tale. So it is about all of those dangers and all of how Victor's egotism, his inability to kind of learn from others and develop relationships, and maybe particularly his inability to care for the creature that he creates, lead to these disasters. But I think what she's saying is that this disaster isn't inherent, like that this isn't an idea of don't try things, don't experiment, don't invent something new, create new ways of being. I think she's very interested in doing that and interested in the pitfalls of doing it as well, so that it has these kind of two strands of both a warning but also maybe a kind of promise and invitation that it could have gone another way. Yeah, is one of the things that interests me anyway.
It's also I've always thought and this is not my field, I don't know anything about it, so shoot me down like an animal here if I've got this wrong. But I always think as well that Frankenstein's creature is a bit like a sort of, like represents humanity itself. And I think it's the very humanist bit in the novel when the creature says to Frankenstein, I can't remember the exact words, but says, I'm only bad because of misery. I was good and then I suffered and now I'm bad. If I'm happy again, I can be good again. And you just think, oh, this is amazing. This is such a beautiful reflection on like how human beings came to be what they are and who we are and how we are. It's such a wonderful sort of humanist mirror of ourselves. Or maybe I've got that wrong. I don't know.
No, I mean, I had the same response to it. And I view it from the lens of, we're presented with a creature as a figure that is, well, it lives beyond, it's a being beyond belief. It's not constrained by any belief system specifically. And this is what you get, subject to someone or something, an entity that's subject to its environment alone. And I really appreciate that gift from Mary Shelley.
Misery made me a fiend. That's the
misery made me a fiend.
The best defense. Every criminal should say it at the dock. The social policy defense.
But I find that so interesting though in the context of I don't know, I'm thinking immediately of like Robert Owen and his big supposedly groundbreaking notion that people were shaped by their environment, and actually if you gave people a good education, looked after people who were working, in the factories and all of this, that actually people weren't destined to be one thing or the other. They weren't born bad and going to stay that way, that there were, nurture and environment played a huge role in who we are. So I think that's such a interesting thing in the kind of context of that, I guess, the social movements as well that were happening at the beginning of the 19th century and that really drove and inspired actually a lot of free thinkers who took up and ran with those ideas in order that it might be possible and worthwhile to try and bring about change in the world, because actually it wasn't a foregone conclusion.
You know who else does this is Olaf Stapledon. In his book about a dog, has anyone read Sirius? He wrote Olaf Stapledon, who is this sort of brilliant, obviously brilliant humanist science fiction writer. You all will have to put him into his historic context. I don't know that, but I read his book Sirius once, which is about a dog that becomes conscious. Sirius after the dog star, it's a sort of fantastical reference. And that's all about like Sirius's existential questioning. Who's he going to be? How is he going to be shaped? And of course, it's really about us, really about human beings and how we're shaped. And again, with this same sort of Shelleyan type thesis that we're formed by society and our environment and our wants and our context and everything else, and that we're not unchanging beings that are sort of predestined or, angels or demons or whatever. It is a good example of a generally humanist theme in science fiction, holding a mirror up to people. Like Vulcans are another one. Roddenberry really isn't interesting that there's these race of aliens which, have suppressed emotion. He's saying this is what would happen if we suppressed all our emotion, or if we tried to be cold and irrational all the time. It's always a mirror, isn't it, for human beings? And that leads me on in a way to someone who's a great admirer of Olaf Stapledon and colleague H.G. Wells, who many people I think would see as the humanist, science fictionist, par excellence. You both had responses to his works, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that Wells is such an interesting figure because of how he's, Jules Verne had already started writing these scientific romances, but his focus, I think, was very much on this idea of the hard science of it all, where it was like, how does these technologies work? How will these kind of specific technical innovations potentially change society in various ways? So kind of famously, Verne says, in my story about going to the moon, they get there in a rocket. Rockets are real. But H.G. Wells invented like a rock that could resist gravity. And Jules Verne is like, show me that rock. But Wells isn't as interested in that, I think. He's very interested in a kind of a scientific or rationalist approach to the world, but he's less interested in the detail of the kind of technical advances that he's depicting. I'm more interested, I think, in the social scientific aspect of it. So I guess you think about the time machine, this idea of it doesn't tell you in any way how to make a time machine. He doesn't know anything about the kind of the physics of time. That's not really the point of it. The point is about imagining how his idea that humanity is devolving in various ways. How would that play out over a massive time scale? So the way that he was seeing society being currently structured with, I think this is his view, a kind of effete elite who don't do any work and just live in luxury, which is produced by the industrious but brutalized working classes. What would happen if these two groups of people remained so separate over an evolutionary span of time that they turn into two kind of completely different species? So these are the kind of questions that he's using a scientific framework given to him by evolution and the science of evolution to work out an idea, a social idea that like directly impacted the immediate social pressures that he was identifying and the things that he wanted to impact directly in the now. So very much using the future as a way to impact the present is one thing definitely that he was doing. But he wrote so much, so he was doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah, 100%. I really enjoy the way, is enjoy the right word? I appreciate how he has this sort of quite plodding, predictable urge towards prophecy. But it's all tied around, again, the potentially destructive elements of science and how almost inevitably there will be an element of destruction, probably total annihilation wrapped up into it, and how that comes up into his, obviously, the War of the Worlds. It's always there in the background. It's always lurking, things to come, the time machine, that threat of destruction, which, obviously infuse his humanism. But I think that's one of the most attractive things about him is that he was always giving that warning. It was always there, just hissing in the background like poison gas. Just, take heed. If we're going to go down these paths, these are the potential results.
And again, directly responding in some cases. I mean, we do have a whole episode on this podcast about the Declaration of Human Rights and Wells's influence on that. But obviously that was exactly that. It was this, you witness the devastation of a world war and see how horrible humanity has the potential to be, or to come, how close you can come to destruction. And then you think, okay, how can I write a document? How can I crystallize my values into human values? And then go through this process of all these people, all these different countries, cultures coming together and trying to figure out what is it that unites us as human beings, and how can we aim for a better world, but based on a document that we can all agree to. I was just thinking too, because I know, Katie, that you've written about Naomi Mitchison as well, and she's another really interesting example to me of somebody she was very involved in humanism and rationalism. She was a high-standing member of the Rationalist Press Association, but also a writer, and also wrote some really amazing science fiction, speculative fiction works. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what she does and how she kind of uses the genre.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's a really interesting person. She really only got into science fiction kind of much later in her life. So she wrote, I think, her first science fiction novel, Memoirs of a Spacewoman, in 1960. That's when she's 60 years old herself. So she'd already had huge careers. And as Maddie said, she's a really prolific novelist and also a campaigner in so many different fields in kind of reproductive rights. She's very involved in histories of British socialism. And she kind of turns to science fiction at this point in her career, I think, in a really interesting way, because there does become this big boom of particularly feminist utopian writing in the 1970s in science fiction, as well as it's called the new wave of science fiction around the 60s and 70s. But she's really a bit before that. And she knew people like Aldous Huxley, and in a way and Wells, and is responding to a sort of older generation of science fiction writers before this big kind of what would be a big boom of queer and feminist writing. She writes Memoirs of a Spacewoman, which is this kind of amazing story of an imaginary utopian future in a kind of Star Trek mold, really. It's like traveling between worlds. They really have a non-interference policy, with all the planets that they go to. But perhaps slightly unlike in Star Trek, the aliens that they meet are really, really alien. They're not at all humanoid. They're like little starfish creatures or giant sea urchins. And her job is to work out how to communicate with them, Mary, the protagonist. And so it's all about pushing on the boundaries of humanity, of consciousness, of how should you relate across difference. She'd seen centuries of which was marked by these world wars. She was very involved in kind of independence movement, both in Scotland and in Botswana. She's really seeing this kind of what will a post-imperial world look like, and is very interested in that idea of, I think, a global community, the possibilities of it, but also the many existing barriers towards it. And so, she imagines it on this, galactic framework where it's all about talking to aliens who, look like caterpillars, but really it is about this possibilities of relationships across difference in I think a really interesting way.
So Naomi Mitchison, obviously a fascinating person, and I haven't read Memoirs of a Space Woman, but I will now. Thanks for the recommendation. I know, Steve, that you're interested in lots of writers, one of whom is Octavia Butler. I don't know if you'd like to say anything about what particularly draws you to her, or how she kind of, I don't know, I guess speaks to your humanism or to humanist values, maybe more broadly.
Yes, I was first drawn to her work upon reading Kindred, which is a book in which it's a time travel novel, but it features a mixed couple from the 1970s in North America who find themselves slipping back into the antebellum horror show of North America. Basically how their relationship would function under those circumstances. And it's an incredibly moving novel because it sparked my interest in history as well. I spend a lot of time just imagining myself in other places and other times. And it really spoke very, very strongly to me about the decisions we make, about who we are, what our values really are, particularly under pressure, what our relationships are under pressure, and either the compromises or successful resolutions to those, which are always something to do with just plain, straightforward, common sense, not being too much of an idiot, and liking people. And if I've got the time, I'll just shoehorn another, it's a set of books, a most famous trilogy, Parable of the Sower, or the Earthseed trilogy, in which, again, she gives us this very horrible dystopian world, which has its salvation in a very straightforward philosophy presented by its protagonist, Lauren, a young Black woman, who just offers an opportunity for people to resolve their problems by accepting change, by understanding the inevitability of change, by centering change in their lives, by having positive fellow feelings. It's very, very straightforward. But the whole point of it is ultimately humanity, Earthseed, this religion, will take us collectively into the stars. But it's just such a fantastic read because I haven't seen utopian ideals or the potentially utopian ideals presented in such a prosaic way. And that's something which is very important to me.
Well, humans figuring themselves out, but using kindness and common sense to do so. Because I think it's funny, isn't it? You kind of think in some ways that's kind of obvious, but then in another way, that is exactly what fiction, and certainly kind of science fiction, does, is it holds things up that you might have actually never questioned or really thought about, and makes you think, oh, actually, maybe that's not such a normal way of doing things, or maybe that is actually troubling. But similarly, this idea, I think, of that feels like it's at the heart of lots of it, that idea of just how do we connect with each other? How do we communicate? Like Katie was saying, in Mitchison's example, how do we have relationships with other people in whichever context it is that we're in? And that feels it's very human, but very humanist as well. At a certain point, zines were a very popular way of disseminating. They kind of arose from science fiction fans, didn't they? It was people who wanted to talk about the ideas and be fans of science fiction, making these cheap, shareable things to communicate more widely with each other, to disseminate ideas, to create fan fiction and that kind of thing. And again, there's something in there that I really love, that kind of accessibility and connectivity that was being created through these, not just within the stories themselves, but outside of those, in the communities that were kind of drawn to them.
Yeah, that sort of activities, hasn't it, sort of migrated online and warped into all sorts of weird and not so wonderful groupings, which I think is potentially one of the hurdles that science fiction as a genre will have to overcome. Because, there are now sets of young men, and it's almost always men, who are seriously anti-humanist, who have almost positioned themselves as handmaidens to Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. And, for example, the writer and publisher Theodore Beale, who also masquerades under the name Vox Day, spelled Day, D-A-Y, they are pushing forward white Christian nationalist ideas. We're back to almost Hugo Gernsback's world of horses in the starship hold and, this crusading mission of white English-speaking Christians, not just across the globe, of course, but into the universe and beyond. So, that is happening.
I feel like that does bring us quite well, though, to the kind of what we always try to ask, which is what we can take from these ideas today, or perhaps in this instance, what science fiction can do for us today. Because obviously, now we've got huge areas of both progress and challenge and, discussion, like AI, biotechnology, all of these things. Aside from those evil players, what can science fiction do for us today? What might we be able to take from maybe some of those historical writers that we've talked about, or writers writing now? What can it still do for us, do you think? Katie?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I'm interested in is, taking this kind of critical look to utopianism and to science fiction in much the same way that, Steve was just talking about with the kind of the reactionary kind of science fiction that have always been a huge part of the genre. That, it's important. And I think lots of the best science fiction is always about being kind of self-reflective about those kind of imaginings and looking at, if we're dreaming of a different world, what is that world actually look like? What are the values that we're bringing to it? If we're inventing something new, then we have to be really serious about interrogating what we're bringing to it. But at the same time, not giving up on that kind of invention and creation. And so I'm really interested in the history of feminist utopianism. And I think that one strand of it has been this amazing and revolutionary. I think Maddie before was talking about this idea of like stripping away the familiarity of accepting just the status quo, things as they are, and instead saying, well, why is it arranged like that? Why is society arranged like this? Why do we divide our identities and the way that we, distribute labor and how we think about what makes a family in particular ways? How do we use gender and why do we use it in the way that we do to create, I guess, on a basic level, a kind of dominator model, a patriarchal model, which, is kind of predicated on misogyny. And so I think that the best feminist utopianism is about saying, it doesn't have to be like that. Look at a different way of imagining the world and kind of making strange the way that we do gender. But I think it's also important to look at the ways in which feminist utopianism has like allied itself to really reactionary forces. So there's a big eugenic strain of feminist utopianism, for example, which sort of locates like, so Charlotte Perkins Gilman is a big figure in this. Her book Herland is a very famous feminist utopia, kind of world of women and one of the lost plateaus Steve was mentioning at the start. But it's very much based on the idea of maintaining a kind of pure white womanhood by excising what she sees as a sort of savage maleness. You know, she kind of racializes the gender difference in a lot of ways, and is very interested in kind of removing all sexual impulse and in stripping away anything that could look like femininity as well. She has a very, very kind of sex negative, anti all kind of gender expression or interest in gender difference, in favor of this. All the women are basically clones of one another, and they have this entirely homogenous society. And I think that part of what motivates her is holding up this idea that this is a sort of paradoxically, like, this is a more natural way of being, like this is closer, that women are closer to nature becomes a big theme in feminist utopianism. And that's both a way of defending womanhood from kind of critiques and sort of women hating rhetoric, but also becomes a way of really essentializing what it means to be a woman and sort of suggesting that the only way of being a woman is in this very specific model, which uses nature, I think, as a kind of stand-in for God. You know, this is how things have to be because this is how God made them. This is how things have to be because this is how nature has ordained it. And so I guess, sorry, to bring it back to the kind of modern day question, I really see this being really important in terms of the rise of transphobia within both kind of radical feminism today, but also just more broadly, like how much anti-trans legislation and feeling that there is, which so often uses this idea of a natural womanhood to police the boundaries of womanhood and femininity and to demonize people who are always portrayed as being unnatural. And so that's why I think that it's important to be critical of that kind of feminist utopianism and also really interested in the kind of feminist science fiction and utopianism which is produced by people like Octavia Butler, but also lots of different writers in the 1970s, by Ursula Le Guin, by people like Marge Piercy and Naomi Mitchison, who are really pushing on the boundaries of what gender is and what gender could be. And you really see this coming out now. And there's so much amazing queer and trans science fiction being produced today by people like Rivers Solomon, by Tori Peters, by Geordie Rosenbach. There's so many people, but like by people who are really interested in an anti-essentialist understanding of gender that I think really comes out of feminism and utopianism, the way that they combine and say, well, what is possible? What do we want to be possible? And not just being confined by a conservative idea of, well, this is the way that things are and this is the way things have historically been. So this is the way that they have to carry on being, and that's how we're going to organize our lives. Sorry, that was quite long.
No, I'm really cheered by your positivity, because I was having dark forebodings about the potential possible uses of modern science fiction. You've opened me up to a number of writers that I'm going to be looking into, because I don't know, have we developed such a diet we've been conditioned on this diet for dystopia? You know, do we still have an appetite for happy endings, for positivity of the way that you describe it? I mean, what I would love to see is a sort of rebirth or reinvestment in the writers from the 70s who are bringing up these subjects. They are the first to speak and be published to a wide readership on these, you know, like Samuel Delany, who was in 1967, pushing forward the ideas of well, we'd now describe them as puberty blockers for his spacefaring folk, who are a class unto themselves entire. And these obviously androgynous humans are the spacefarers, and they are exoticized, and they are subject to all of the adulation and mistreatment that you could imagine. There's some wonderful, it's called, what's it? I and Gomorrah is the name of the short story. And he does lots of ventures into gender and sexuality. He's also quite unreadable. Some of his longer books, like Beryl 17, etc. But his short stories are massively digestible and need a reissue.
One of the questions we had on here was whether science fiction is a fundamentally humanist genre. I think one of the things that's really interesting about, well, what you've both just said is that it's fundamentally a human genre, and as such, there is lots of room for it to be used, misused, for the ideas explored in it to actually be deeply unsettling. So for all of the kind of possibilities of approaching things in a rational and, you hope, compassionate way, there are pitfalls. But I'm still going to pitch the question anyway. Is science fiction a fundamentally humanist genre?
I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes. But like you say, Maddie, there are obvious pitfalls. It's science fiction. Some of the adherents of science, particularly the new variants connected with genetic research, artificial intelligence, they are not looking for positive outcomes. They're not looking for human-friendly outcomes. So, no, that's the answer, really. There are some bad players here.
I really agree, and I think it's important to look at both kind of strands within the genre. I was also thinking I was going to answer Octavia Butler to my favourite atheist later, so I'm going to have to rethink that. But I was really interested in what you were saying, Steve, about Butler, and I think in the Parable of the Sower books, what's so interesting is that it's totally true that it's the kind of utopian answer to the very near dystopia that she imagines is found in this kind of very common sense approach to acknowledging the humanity of everybody and of kindness and liking people, as you said. But it's interesting that it's framed as a religion, that she founds, that Lauren in the Earthseed books founds Earthseed as a religion, and what she says is that God is change. That's kind of the tenet of the Seed books, right? So it's interesting to make a religion out of this kind of secular train of thought, that there's just not this hard line, I think, between this is a religious way of approaching something and this is a secular way of approaching something. It's like there's this possibility of reforging religious impulses as well within a science fiction framework, which seems really interesting to me.
And I suppose it all does rest on that idea that human beings are the responsible actors, I guess, the makers of their own destinies. What happens to them? What happens to humankind in general, or whatever that might look like in a science fiction text. Oh, it's so interesting. Anyway, so to end on the question we always give, I will ask you, who is your favourite humanist or atheist? Could be in this space, pun intended, or beyond, that we, well, either have or haven't mentioned. But shall I start with you, Steve? So
I'd probably say Samuel Delany, because a lot of, again, very straightforward, ungod-centered world building he was involved in. He was just ahead of his time. And his work needs to come back.
Well, you won't believe me that the person I was just about to say was Samuel Delany instead of Octavia Butler. But yeah, okay. Well, I love Butler and Delany, but I think that someone we haven't mentioned who I think is really interesting is James Tiptree Jr., who is another author of the kind of 60s and 70s feminist science fiction, and is someone who's a very complicated person And one of the things I was interested about them was that they were sort of revealed to have been writing under a pen name. They were known as this kind of great male voice in feminist science fiction alongside Delany. And then it was revealed that their birth name was Alice Sheldon. They've been writing under this kind of pseudonym the whole time. But I think what's particularly interesting to me is there's been lots of recent interesting scholarship about Tiptree and how the pseudonym was sort of much more than a pseudonym. It was this other persona that Sheldon had created, very much playing with gender and with the idea of becoming a different person and using science fiction to do that as a vehicle of potentially transforming the self and becoming the person that you want to be. And so I think they're a really good example of taking kind of the speculation of science fiction and imagining impossible worlds off the page and sort of applying it to life and showing how it doesn't, Maddie, you were saying earlier about the kind of zine communities and the fan communities that arise. And I think that, Tiptree's a really good example of someone where the utopianism and the science fictionality doesn't just exist on the page of the stories, but really extends out into this world of fan culture and author correspondences and interviews and zines and stuff. So, they're another person who's super interested in all the questions we've been talking about poking at the edges of what does it mean to be human and how is ethical relation across difference possible.
For me, it's always Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek. And I think what's really interesting about the new generation of Star Trek is that it's set not in a completely even utopian, progressive, and nothing ever goes wrong sort of history, but in the more recent Star Trek, like Starfleet Academy, there's been a massive, horrible tragedy and a rupture, and the Federation has fallen apart, and they've got to rebuild it. And I think that's a sort of answer to the dystopian tendency of our recent times as well, is admitting even in that most utopian of genres that things sometimes do go wrong. But then, very Star Trek, very humanist, very Gene Roddenberry, very positive science fiction, you rebuild again. And, you can do it, and people are good, and they can work together, and they can do amazing things.
Amazing. God, we got some great little quotes from this episode, poking at the edges of being human and weirdos at the margins, etc., etc. So last but not least, where can people find out about your work if they want to know or read more by you? Shall I start with you, Steve?
Oh, I can only direct people to my 20th century website. Just enter my name, S.I. Martin, and you'll come clanking to it.
Yeah, I have a website too, katiemcgregorstone.co.uk, and I sort of use my Instagram to talk about books as well. So that's I'm cyborg_feminist on Instagram.
Thank you both so much. That has been such an interesting conversation. A big reading list now to go away with as well, which we'll try and capture in the show notes for the episode. But it has been such a pleasure to speak to you both. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for listening to Unholy Histories, the Humanist Heritage podcast, brought to you by Humanist UK. To join, support, or find out more about Humanist UK's campaigns and services, visit humanists.uk, or you can follow us on social media at Humanists UK. This podcast was produced by Humanise Live. Find out more about creating content for compassionate communities at www.humanise.live.
And you can find out more about the rich history and influence of humanism on the Humanist Heritage website at heritage.humanist.uk.